Manila, Art Deco era, twins catching a falling star, and a singer who wants to chase a dream. So that's the quick summary. Try to get people interested. What I wanted to talk was how it came to be, where this came from.
Welcome back to the Comics Cube, everyone. I am here with Tori Tadyar. And kamusta? How are you?
Doing good. It's a Sunday afternoon, so just getting ready for work tomorrow.
Don't remind me. Tori is the creator behind this book, Twinkle Twinkle, published by Comiket and distributed under the Philippine International Comics Festival, PICOF, which will have its 2022 event in September. Tori, the first question I ask everyone when they come on the show is, why do you love comics?
Okay, for this one, why I love comics, I would say I love any form of story. What I compare comics to and why is it standing out for me is, let's say if you compare novels where you read everything, you try to imagine everything, every scene, your brain has to fill it, unless of course there's a few illustrations that gives you a clue. And then film. So let's say movies, you watch movies, there's everything is you see everything. Your imagination just accepts what's happening, and then you can't really stop at any particular scene that, for example, you really like what happened on this scene. You can't rewind it, or well, now you can, but usually you wouldn't be able to. For comics, what sets it apart for me is it sits in between the two. So it gives you rich visuals, but it also, in the space between the panel, also lets your brain work, lets your imagination fill up those gaps. What's happening in the background? How did it get from this scene to this scene? And it enables you to, I don't know, it lets you participate in the story while also appreciate the visuals that are all served in front of you. And it's its own visual language. Like I was reading, I think it was Understanding Comics by Scott
Yeah.
McCloud, and when I was reading it, I'm like, oh, I never thought of it this way, because it's so intuitive to just read a comic. You see words there and you see pictures happening, and your brain just knows how to connect all these pictures happening to create this one story. So yeah, that's why I love the medium.
Uh, when did you realize you could draw? When did you realize you could write? And when did you realize you could put them together?
Hmm. I think so. Like, let's go back to the very early years of my life. So the earliest I could find is this. There's this book I wrote called The Magic Ocean. There's no ocean. There's no magic. It's about a 6-year-old's birthday party. It was drawn on like stapled scratch paper from my aunt's office. But basically what kids do. So I would say I started drawing along with my cousins when Pokemon came out. That's my earliest memory.
Mhm.
Pokemon came out. We got the book of all the Pokemon. We would sit down across the table and just draw a copy from the book, our favorite Pokemon. I would go for Voltorb. So I'm just drawing a circle at that time. But I really enjoyed those moments where we were just sitting together and then copying those works. So that's when I would say I would start drawing. And then I enjoyed they eventually moved on, didn't pursue drawing, but I continued. So I liked copying of the anime I watched, the movies I watched. And then I would say storytelling, the example I gave you, wherein I was 6 years old, I created my own storybook. I think it started even before I could remember. Like, I've always wanted to write stories, regardless of what's happening. So it's a kid's birthday party, or even I think one of the first novels I attempted when I was 7 was about me getting a dog, which was 2 chapters long, but I considered it a novel. And then combining the two together, I would say it started with maybe in grade 3. So I was 10 years old. My seatmate and I, we were both huge anime fans. And then we said, let's just make our own anime, just the two of us. We didn't know that it takes a studio to create what we were watching on screen. So she said, I'd write the story, you draw everything. And I said, yeah, let's do it. And then it started with drawing a face. And I
Yeah.
said, how do the animators do it? And then I tried creating per each letter, there's a face. So that if we needed a word to form, then I just put the faces on top of each other, just flip it, and that's animation. So I stopped at letter D. So it was a lot of hard work. But then in the future, I realized, oh, I can do something like comics, wherein it's animation, but I am doing it on my own. I write, I draw, so maybe what I'll just combine the two.
Okay. Any specific anime? Any specific movies?
Any specific? I grew up with. If you grew up in the Philippines, you'd be familiar with Ghost Fighter. You'd be familiar with all those afternoon animes that's in Tagalog.
Yeah.
So all of I'm a fan of all of that. I watched everything. Um, for movies, it's mostly the Disney movies. So I grew up with the VHS tapes of all the classic Disney movies. So I again watched everything. So whatever I saw at that time, that's what I was going for.
Who would you say are your main influences when it comes to, your art style, your writing style, making comics, etc.?
For okay, so the I would say the earliest one, the comics where it really inspired me to, hey, I can create comics or maybe I can tell a story like that will be the Witch comics. I'm not sure if you're
Yeah,
familiar with this one.
I know the
It's
witch.
for young girls. So it's the about five girls, they're friends, and they go on this magical adventures. They can transform magically into like older versions of themselves. And I would say that those were the first comics that I really related to. So at that time I wasn't that big into comics because all I could see from my older cousins were they had these copies of X-Men. I was 8, 9 years old, and 8, 9 year old girl, you're not really into the action that's happening in X-Men, all the letters that you have to read. So
Yeah.
when Witch came out, it was a strange phenomena among my all girls elementary school. Like you would see the copies, you would say, "Oh wow, that's this," and then you open it, and then it comes out monthly. I couldn't even afford the comic at that time. So what I do is I'll wait for my classmates to get the latest copy, and then I'll borrow it. I'll read it during the break times. I'll return it. So during that time, it was really, to this day I would say it's an experience like that first issue. I wanted to be there. I wanted to have my own special power. So that was how I started, like, oh, something that I can relate to, something, a story that I could tell. So that was a huge influence. I would say the next influence is if you're familiar with Ragnarok Online. I was a really
Yeah.
big gamer of Ragnarok Online as a 10-year-old. So I played the game, and then they released the manhwa where it was based off of, so the Ragnarok Into
Oh,
the Abyss. So those were my first comics, physical manga manhwa that I was collecting, and the art was super good. So Myung Jin Lee was a huge inspiration for me when I thought I wanted to be an RPG artist. And then after that, I think it was more the online manga that I've been reading. So I would read scanlations. My friends and I would trade recommendations of what comic to read, and started from there. Now I'm more I read children's graphic novels. I read the adult classics. My fiance even got me into DC just very recently. So it's a huge influence pool, but the very start for it would be Witch.
all of it is comics, right? All of it is art.
Yes.
Speaking of, can you give me some background about your career, your art career, not your career? Yeah.
So for art career, I took IT, I took management in college, and I but before that I was telling myself I want to be an animator. It was my dream ever since I saw this one episode in Disney Channel showing you how animators worked. Like they had super fun offices, they played games while they worked, they would draw all day, they're paid to draw. So I said that's my dream. I want to be an animator for the Disney Channel. And after that, the reality of life, like I tried looking up art schools, how do you get into Disney, and it would cost you like 4, 6 million just to study in these schools, and my family didn't have that money. So I just gave it up. I'll go for a stable career in the Philippines, which is in IT. So that's how I started. And then a few years after that, because I told the story of how I love drawing, how I love telling stories in my school years. A few years into work, I saw this ad for Comic at University. Basically, they were touting it as learn how to make your own comics. You get a free table at the end where you can sell the comic that you made. So, okay, low commitment. I just create one, fulfill a lifelong dream, print it out, and then go back to my corporate life. But what happened there was the comic that I worked on for Comic at University, which I was intending to be like 30-page one shot.
Was it Sagala?
When of the
Yeah.
Sagala, yes. So Sagala was my first comic. I didn't think much of it. I just said one shot, and then when I was drawing it, the last page, I said, "Oh, let's add like a cliffhanger because if it doesn't sell, I have a cliffhanger, and then if it does sell, then people would want the next book." And it did sell. So the first book won the Comiket Award, that best comics in 2017. So I was surprised I won it. Very thankful though. And after that, I got more readers coming in asking me what's gonna happen next. What's gonna happen next? So I went ahead and created book two. I did the same thing. I added a cliffhanger at the end. So to the readers, I personally did not know what was happening next as I finished each chapter. But eventually, I was able to get to 4 chapters, compiled everything into one volume in 2019, and thankfully, it also sold out. So I do have a bunch of readers who are actually buying my comic work. So that's
Yeah.
my first comic, and then the Twinkle Twinkle, which you have, is my second. And now I'm working on another comic. So
I will point out you guys in the Philippines can buy Sagala off of Shopee and Lazada, but you can also read it on PenLab. PenLab.inc
yes.
/title/Sagala. Okay. Were you active in the Comic Con scene before you got involved with Comic Con? Like, were you going to conventions or?
I would say I was a bit intimidated by the conventions. I've always wanted to go. Like, I would read up about it. Oh, it's an event for comics. But if I look at it from, let's say, around 2010s, early 2010s, Comic Con was about people printing their own comics, and mostly the comics were mecha comics, action comics that I couldn't really relate to.
Yeah.
So when Comiket was there, then I write whatever story I want. And that's the first Comiket I went to was the 2016 one where I was selling. And that's where I discovered it's not as one-dimensional as I originally thought it would. So it was a lot of other girls, other women creating comics. There were even kids creating their own comics. So that's what opened me to the world of conventions. Like it wasn't just this, I'm sorry to say, but like the sweaty man convention that I previously thought it was. And I was very happy that I started seeing it under that new light.
I think there's a big part of that that is absolutely true because I was going in like 2010, 2011. And I think that if I had to compare the local comic scene now to the local comic scene there, it's definitely more diverse now. I feel like Paulo
Mhm.
Heras has changed the game because of all of the, like your book has such production quality to it that I don't think we would have seen 10 years ago. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Plus,
Yeah, because what I was seeing before was like you print it and they call it ash can. So
yeah,
like you hold it and then the black ink goes into your hand and it's all stapled. You create it yourself. The first Sagala was actually like that. It was bond paper folded in half, staple in the middle. And then we got to Twinkle Twinkle, which is if you raise it up, it has gold foil. Like I specifically requested, since I'm not paying for the printing, I want the gold foil happening. I want the spot
yeah.
art so it's sticky in the front. So
Spot
it's huge
gloss.
thanks to Sir Pao and the Comiket team.
If you were to tell people what Twinkle Twinkle was all about, what would
Mhm.
you say?
I would say it's Manila Art Deco era, twins catching a falling star, and a singer who wants to chase a dream. So that's the quick summary. Try to get people interested. What I wanted to talk was how it came to be, where this came from. Because after Sagala, which is a Filipiniana fantasy actiony kind of story, Twinkle Twinkle started from actually a trip I had to Palawan a few
Yeah.
years ago. So in Palawan, I went on this boat cruise, not a cruise. You go into a bangka and then you go down a river. So it's called the Iwahig River. So
Okay.
what happens there is you go there at night, and then when you get on the boat, it's a river, so it's a thin strip of water. The the sky was clear, no clouds at all, and the stars were all out. Like you could see the Milky Way. Usually, you'd only see that in mountains, very dark places. So you could almost see the Milky Way. So when I stepped onto the bangka, it was you had the whole sky open up in front of you. There were stars everywhere, and then the banks of the river, both banks were had trees and they had fireflies. So the fireflies were also glowing. So it was twinkling on the side, twinkling up top, and you're on a river. So the river was reflecting the sky. So on the river was also, you could see the stars, and then there was also bioluminescent plankton. So if you don't know what it is, basically if you move something in the water, it glows because the plankton, I don't know, the plankton gets activated or something. But as the boatman was going through the river, the ore would usually, when it hits the water, it glows. And you on the boat, it's actually glowing. So it was super magical for me. To this day, it was one of the most magical experiences of my life. So I said, wow, I need to do something about stars. And then I also, I think Sagala is always, they say it's a sibling story. I like stories about siblings, that dynamic, not much on romance, but here I wanted, what if there were twins and then they could catch these falling stars? Because in Iwahig I could reach out and I put my hand in the water, it will glow. So what if they could catch falling stars that came to Earth? What if those falling stars weren't just passing by? What if they actually landed on Earth? What can you do with that star, that stardust? So these twin stars, they would catch these falling stars. But what if they had a sister who had ingested a supernova? So that ups the stakes a bit. So that was the main story I had. And then what came after as the next wave of inspiration for me was realizing that Manila hasn't always looked like the Manila I grew up with. So Manila wasn't always this city where you have so many people, so many vendors on the streets. There was a time, and I think there were a couple of articles about it, that Manila had this, they call it a golden age, where the streets were wide, they were really designing the city, and the buildings there were designed Art Deco. And Art Deco was something I didn't think would match up with like Philippine history, Philippine architecture. So I went ahead and looked at it because I like the Art Deco visuals from, let's say, The Great Gatsby, Lackadaisy Cats, which is an online comic if you're familiar, Transistor, which is a game that was,
Yeah.
it's also using Art Deco elements. So when I started digging into it, I realized there are actual standing Art Deco buildings in Manila. You just need to know where to look and how to appreciate it. Um, and the history, we had this Crystal Arcade, which was a big building, Art Deco style, that got ruined in the war. So I wanted to set this story about stars, about these siblings, into this Art Deco era, magical sort of 1930s, 1940s Manila, and what's going to happen from there. So it's a one shot because it's full color. Sagala was black and white. People, my readers kept saying, "Why don't you just do it in color?" And to those readers who asked, it was money. I was the one printing those comics. So when Sir Pao and Peacock came along and they said, "We'll print it for you," I said, "This needs to be full color." So tortured myself with full color.
People don't understand how much color drives up the cost of a book.
Yes.
Like a lot. So where how did you, so the book obviously has its it's rooted in magical realism. How do you do that? How do you balance out the magic and the realism in such a way that it doesn't look silly, that we still buy into the premise instead of being like, they, what do you mean catching stars? People can't catch
I would
stars.
I'd say it's because my work always skewed to a younger reader base who's more used to this. Like a lot of kids' books are fantasy. It's all about magic. So I get away with it. So the art style itself is it's not that mature. So people tell me, "Is your art for kids?" And I would say, if your kid can read this much words, then go ahead. But it skews that way. So I get away with all those magical elements that I put in terms of balancing it, I'd say there's a little bit of like the Iwahig experience. If I didn't know that it would be like that and someone described it to me, I'd say, well, that's too otherworldly to be real. But I experienced it, so there's still magic in every day.
What do you think that says about the way we perceive magic and adulthood?
This is the common theme. Like I just read a graphic novel for kids called Seance Tea Party, and they say the magic disappears when you grow up. And the book basically says you can grow up still holding on to this magic. You don't have to lose it.
Where does your sense of design come from? Because like you've mentioned a lot of, you've mentioned a lot of anime, you've mentioned a lot of games, and other comics that have inspired you. Uh, but I feel like in that sense, a lot of it is you're talking about draftsmanship. But
Mhm.
but so where does the layout, the sense of design and composition come from?
I'd say it's coming from all the comics that I've read. Like if you're talking about how I get the panels out, and I would say if you're reading Sagala, I promise you I'd improve. I've improved in the past few years because I was looking back at my old work and so why was I making these paneling choices? I just wanted to draw pretty faces, but now I got a better sense of it. I would say because of all the comics I've been reading since then. So I'm collecting graphic novels. I read comics online. And every time I read, it's always something amazing that I'm discovering how someone would approach paneling, how someone would do this scene, what angles would they use, and even film. Like ever since I got into comics, I'm more um, observant of what's happening in films. Like how would the director block this scene? Where would this come from? How do they build suspense in this kind of scene? So it's a lot of learning, a lot of observing, taking it in, and then figuring out how do I apply these same principles to my work. So
That's about the layouts and the composition and the paneling. But I mean, like, also I also meant to include things like, for example, the cover. There's a lot of design work on that cover,
mhm.
right? Like the idea to have Hanan look this way and she's bigger than the twins, the title being sideways and being a ribbon. Like, where, like, how did you learn this? I guess is my question.
I I don't know because ever since I knew I like designing things. In high school, I like creating posters. I like adjusting things until it looks the way I want it to look. So I didn't get any formal training in design. I didn't get any formal training in art. I just see a lot of things. I like it. I try to apply it in my own work to the same as the paneling one. And if it looks good, then I keep on tweaking it until it looks good. So that's my approach. Not for everyone.
I've definitely heard some artists say that before. Sometimes I'd ask them a question. They'd be like, "Well, the work just knows what it wants to be."
Yeah.
Why do you love? Why are you attracted to stories about siblings?
I don't know again. I keep getting stumped by these questions. I grew up with a lot of cousins. I have just one sibling, but I do have a lot of cousins who are older than me who I treat as my older brothers. And I grew up with them, the stories I told you about learning how to draw alongside them. So I really enjoyed like just having let's say it's a default friend. That's what I call a sibling. Like they get assigned to you by birth and then you have to grow up with them and you share a lot of experiences with them. And most of the fondest memories I've had was always with my sibling, my cousins, growing up. So I think that's where I'm pulling it from. And the dynamic is really interesting because if, for example, you write about, let's say, romance, people know how it will end up. Like they will end up together or they won't end up together. But if you friendship as well as having siblings, it's a different bond that you share and it's a different bond I get to explore in the work. Like it's you tease them, you get mad at them, but at the end you have each other. So I like that dynamic. I would say developing that dynamic over a story where you get problems one after the other.
Okay. Um, there is a. Can you talk about working on the color of this book as well? Because I know you said you killed yourself, but what exactly were the technical challenges for you?
Basically the time it takes. So I said at the beginning that I'm getting ready for work tomorrow. So I do work a full-time job that eats up to 8 to 10 hours a day on weekdays. And then I only get to draw afterwards. So
You have to
taking time to
commute.
draw, I have to commute before the pandemic. Now it's thankfully it's not every day that I have to go to work. But yes, there's the commute is actually when I write the stories. When I get to home and sit down, that's when I draw it. So
Okay.
it doesn't end. Like I don't have a time when I can just leave the brain blank.
I hear that
But yeah,
writers
for
never stop working. Either they're writing or they're thinking about writing.
yeah, it's true. Unless of course you play video games, in which case that's the perfect distraction. But it also inspires you to wonder what your next work is going to be about. But the colors, like coloring, I would say the challenge is I don't close my lines. If you look at the work, it's very sketchy. My line work isn't as immaculate as other artists. So it's I always leave, for example, I draw hair, there's a hole there. If you try using a fill bucket tool, your whole canvas goes out. So my approach to coloring was just color it like you would a regular drawing. So that's time consuming. So that was the challenge for me. I actually worked with Shar Yap. She's the sister of my office mate. She's also a very famous artist online. I contracted her during the time. Can you help me with flats, colors? So she would be the one filling it in so that I'd have time to just do the shading afterwards. So the challenge is time.
It's amazing that it looks really greatly colored when it's the first thing you've ever professionally comics colored. So I'm amazed. So
Thank you.
Disney Books has recently announced that you have been signed to a 3-book deal. So for called Highsummer. So starting out as somebody who wanted to work in Disney animation, how's it feel getting a deal for Disney Books?
it I would say I'm still not absorbing. I haven't digested the whole thing yet. But basically, when Disney, I'm not sure if the listeners are familiar with how traditional publishing works, how pitching over works. But basically, we um, how do I say we submitted the work to several editors, and I didn't expect anyone to get back. Honestly, maybe interest from one, and then I get an offer to print just one book because initially I was pitching it as just one book, not a series. And then when Disney came and then they had an offer, I was like, any all the others are this. I was zeroing in on Disney. Like I couldn't believe that Disney was offering for this. So when Disney, it was a no-brainer to choose Disney during the time.
What is Highsummer going to be about?
So Sagala was Filipiniana fantasy. So it's like Spanish colonization era mixed with, let's say, RPG elements. Twinkle Twinkle was Art Deco in the 1930s. So the way I'd go about it is about how we were colonized, like Spanish colonization, American colonization. I skipped Japanese for a while. So this one is really more modern day and before we were colonized. So High Summer is about basically if what if you had a magical boarding school. So if it's familiar, it's basically Hogwarts or Camp Half Blood that I grew up reading these kinds of books but didn't really relate because they're in the US, they're in
Yeah.
the UK. They have winters, they have Halloweens. We don't have that. People who go trick or treating, we shout at them saying we don't have that here.
No, go to a
So
cemetery.
exactly. So for me, why it's tomorrow, not today? What Halloween? And then you have kids out there with blankets. Like this isn't legit. So for me, I wanted to create that because again, my work appeals to younger readers, even if initially they weren't my target audience. Sagala was written for, let's say, older teenagers or people my age. But then kids would always come and try to look through my work, and I say, no, that has violence. So I don't have anything to give younger kids. So I wanted to write a story for, let's say, if I were 9 years old, which was one comic, what's the other comic that I want to read? And I wanted that book to be about the Philippines, the kids to see themselves in that setting. And I wanted to add, because I mentioned Percy Jackson as one of the books I was reading, what if you explored mythology? Because I'm a huge fan of Greek mythology, Norse mythology. So I was a geek growing up about these kinds of things. With the moment I learned about it from, let's say, Yu-Gi-Oh, I would search about what is this Egyptian mythology, and I would learn so much about it. So what if I have this book that was really fun, a really fun adventure for kids, and then it would also ask them, who are these gods, goddesses, what are these creatures that I'm reading about, and learn about the wide selection of Philippine mythology that's untapped because I grew up not knowing these. I'm just only learning about them as I do my research for the book. So that would be interesting, and that would be my main point. Like kids going on an adventure with magic and then learning about mythology. That's perfect for me. Like I'm making this for 9-year-old me.
For Philippine mythology too, because I feel like you're right. Absolutely. I also know more about, Greek and Norse mythology than I do about Filipino mythology. And that's a
Right.
tragedy.
Yes.
It's
And
sad.
usually the books we have, so there's a lot of amazing works on Philippine mythology recently, and it's in the comic, especially in comics. Like there's a lot like mythology classes is amazing, Trece, which is on Netflix, and a lot of even the newer ones, they really are into Philippine mythology. My problem with those books is I can't take horror at all. Like
Oh,
I could not read about mangkukulam all the time. Like I couldn't read about all these horror creatures. It's a very distinct element of Philippine mythology, I would say. Like the scariness of these creatures. But I wanted to see what's the non-horror type. Like if I were a kid reading a non-horror book, so I had to explore other like the deities, the friendly creatures. That's what I'm going
Yeah.
into right now. So that's what I wasn't seeing. Like I wasn't seeing a mythology book that wasn't scaring me. So that's also what I wanted to create, like mythology that's for younger readers, I would say, before they get into
I was going
the
to
deeper,
say
heavier work.
I was gonna say that's unfortunate that you can't take horror, considering that the Manananggal kind of, by definition.
When I was younger, I would say I loved horror, like Philippine ghost stories books. That was very famous when I was growing up. I loved reading them. I loved scaring other people. But then I came to the point where I couldn't take a bath alone. So so I said, okay, I can't do this to myself anymore. So now I'm just a scaredy cat. I know all about it. I prefer not to dwell on it. That's why I'm looking at what are the other elements, unexplored elements of Philippine mythology that haven't been in a story yet.
It is interesting how, for example, you can, a huge part of being creative is you take something that already exists, like in this case, like Hogwarts, right? And then you just switch something. So like you switch it, you make it set in the Philippines, and you use Filipino mythology. Like, how do you think the international audience, because I think we have seen a little bit of a wave towards being interested in Filipino culture. How does it, but it's still
Mhm.
not completely prevalent. How does it feel being on the forefront of that? Because this is Disney books. So how does it feel being there, like right in front?
Mhm. I it's a lot of pressure that I'm putting on myself, and I hope I don't have it. But I would like to think that the readers wouldn't treat this as the only the Bible about the Philippines. Like this will be read by kids in the U.S. and this may be all they would hear about the Philippine. They would think it may become a stereotype. Like the mythology that we have in the Philippines, it's not as like Greeks have one pantheon. But in the Philippines, you have so many groups, so many cultures that do not really intersect. So we don't have that one whole Filipino pantheon. It's always going to be the Tagalog pantheon, the Bisaya pantheon, the Ilocano, the different tribes that we have all across the archipelago. So what I wanted to do was to not to step on those cultures, but not also use exclusively the Tagalog pantheon, because I wanted to show that there are um, other I would say other folklore, other stories that are untapped. Because I've always been seeing, like, you'll always hear about Bathala, you'll always hear about Amansinaya, and a lot of writers, a lot of comics artists use the Tagalog pantheon because it's right there. But I want to shed some light, not exactly represent the whole thing, but like maybe tap into it. And then ultimately, what I want to do is, if, for example, people get more interested about Philippine mythology, they research it, they might be hard pressed to find one comprehensive source. But I do want to point them at the other creators that we have that are exploring in depth these cultures, these stories that I'm not entitled to own. I don't represent. But basically, I just want it to be a starting point, and then you branch out from there. So hopefully that's what happens. I don't want like anyone telling me, why are you saying that this is the fact when it's not fact. It's a story for kids I wrote, loosely inspired by all the stories I've been hearing growing up from different friends who came from different parts of the country.
Do you think so? So does Will Highsummer involve, for example, if you have like one god of, like, say, one god of war, and then another god of war from another tribe, like, would they intersect? Will you be doing any of that kind of thing?
That's one I'm still figuring out how it's going to work in a way that, not, people won't say that, oh, why did you do that? That's not how this god's supposed to be. So I'm trying to really, it's inspired, it's based on, but I'm not saying that it's fact.
Yeah.
So one thing that, let's say, the Percy Jackson series did well was Greek and Roman. They were able to put that together in the Heroes of Olympus books, basically, as this is the god of blank. and then this was one aspect, this was one aspect, how they presented to different groups of people. So that one was possibly one approach that I could take, but I'm still figuring out how all of these will come together, because I'm getting creatures from all across the archipelago, not just, let's say, one group, and I'm only allowed to explore this one group of characters.
Are you consulting with anyone, any friends from different parts of the country, different
Yes, yes.
cultures?
So I
Yeah.
am trying to find, like, I want to make sure that someone belonging to that tribe or belonging to this place knows and gives input to how did I treat this. Most of the story is supposed to be agnostic of the location. It's supposed to just be these kids having fun in a school and then going on adventures to a beach, to a mountain, let's say. So it's not supposed to be how would I say, this one tribe, this is all that they explore. So they're jumping all around. But
Great.
the story itself, I want to say it's supposed to be universal. So anyone who reads it should be able to relate to it to some level.
I mean everything, right? If the themes are there are universal, everyone should be able to relate to anything.
Yes. So it's really more the side topics, the creatures that the kids will encounter, which I hope will spark, let's say, an interest into, oh, what's that? What's that about Philippine mythology?
You specifically would where would your heritage be from in the Philippines?
I I
Because I'm just
grew
a
up, so
Manileño, so like I got nothing. So
yeah, my parents were coming from Ilocos as well as Batangas and Bulacan, but I didn't have most of my classmates before they would go home to their provinces during the summer. Me, I just stayed here. And then I do have the cousins that I was talking about. They are half Igorot. So they would go to Bontoc every summer, every Christmas, and I would hear some of their stories. So it's again, I'm based in Manila, and what I hear from other people, like what are the stories that they have here, and I attend talks on, so for example, Visayan pantheon, Visayan mythology. Um, I try to get in as much as I can, learn as much as I can, and then figure out how do I add that to the story in a way that someone who sees it might be interested in it.
how did you feel? What was your reaction when, because you pitched this as one book, when Disney
Mhm.
came to you and said, "Give us three"?
It's partly happy, partly, oh my god, this is going to take so much work. So again, the
Was it
comics
was
takes a
it a
long.
thing? Was that non-negotiable? Did they say it was three or nothing?
Basically, I pitched it as one book, but I can expand it to a series. So I put in, like, I can do this as a sequel, I can do this as a sequel, but basically I can end it at book one. And then they went ahead and said, "Oh, we want three." So yeah, it's I'm happy that it's going to be a series, because the books I was reading growing up, if you're a kid reader, you know that it never really ends in one book. You want the next book, you want the next book. So I wanted that same experience as well for whoever my readers are going to be. But at the same time, yeah, it's again, this is a full color book. It's the longest I've written. So Sagala was 170, but that was across 4 years. Twinkle Twinkle is 120 full color. It took me 2 years to create. This one is 200 plus. So I'm looking at like double the work of what I was already doing. So let's see. It's a lot of work, 3 books.
And when is the
Hopefully
first
I
one out?
finish it. The first one's coming out in 2024. No date yet. But just stay tuned for announcements.
That's insane. So basically, for the same amount of time you did Twinkle Twinkle, you have to do double the work.
Yes, but the good thing about this is I'm working with a team now. So I shared before that I was working with one flatter who was helping me with the colors. Now I do have a team who will help me with colors as well as the letters. So typesetting for me is a pain. I always screw up in lettering for some reason. There's always going to be a typo. And then I also put out a call in Twitter asking for, I really want this team to be all Filipino. Like, we're working on an international book, but I want this to be a diverse Filipino group who's helping me with the art, who may be able to infuse their own experiences in the background details, the props. Like that for me will be the perfect team. Like if this is a Filipino team telling a Filipino story to an international audience.
So you don't have the team complete yet.
Not yet.
So you heard it here first, folks. If you still, she just told you what she needed. So go apply. I do think it is admirable that you are basically writing a book that you said would be something that would have appealed to you when you were younger. Do you think there was a I don't even think I need you to answer this question, but do you think there was a shortage of books that appealed to people like you when you were younger?
Well, whatever was famous was what I read. But again, most of the famous books during that time will be your international books that talked about experiences from the West, or
Yeah,
anime shows that showed you what is the Japanese feudal culture. So I was learning a lot about other countries, but not a lot about my own. So that's what I wanted to bring to the table. That even now I'm still missing. Like if you had to ask a child, or you had to give a book to a child, there's a lot of books already, but again, they still skew to what's available in the bookstores, which often are these international books featuring experiences that are not their own. So it's good to learn, but also it would be good to see, like, wow, that's a place I know, or that's an experience I have.
very cool. You mentioned that you were going through our various stages of colonization. Is that something that you think about a lot? Our history of colonization?
Yeah, the some people not really think about it, like obsess over it and then start hating people, but more of
Because there's a lot of that on
under
the internet.
yes, it is. There's a lot of it on the internet, but for me, it's understanding where we are, and then understanding why other people are like this way, and just hoping why do they have this privilege. So it's really more understanding myself. That's what I wanted to take from it. Ha, it's heavy topic. I disagree with what happened. I don't like what happened, but at the same time, it is what happened. So how do we learn from it? How do we prevent like bad things happening that's coming out of it, that's we're still looked down upon, where we should be standing on the same level as them?
Ever since you started making comics, and I guess I'll close off with this question. Ever since you started making comics, um, and getting published for it, so from Sagala onwards, what have you learned about yourself?
Hmm. What I learned about myself here is, before I said I just wanted to write stories. So I just wanted to write like whatever I read, like fairy tales. And the stories that I wrote before were always, the characters were always named something like Ashley or Yamato. So it was based on what I was reading during the time. And what I've been discovering with Sagala was the first one where I had Filipino characters, and I liked it. I liked writing about it because it was so close to my experience, like what the words you would use, how you would fight with your sibling with these words, were very close to home. And that's where I realized that I liked writing about my own experience, my own culture. And I wanted as much as possible for other people to be able to see that, to read about it. And now that I will have an international platform with Highsummer coming out in 2024, I want to push that as well. These kinds of experiences, this kind of culture. If you can read about aliens in space, if you can read about magical other worlds, then you can learn about the land I call home.
It's a great way to close it off. Thank you, Tori Tadyar.
Thank you so much, Duy.
Congratulations so much.
Thank you,
Congratulations so
thank you.
much. Congratulations.